Hello, my name is Thomas Saenz. I'm the President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. MALDEF is a nationwide civil rights organization whose mission is to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. We do that through a network of offices, including our headquarters in LA, where we were founded in San Antonio, and offices in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Our goal is to ensure that the Constitution is respected and honored with regard to the Latino community. We do our work in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and voting rights. In education, we've worked on issues as basic as ensuring that Latino students are able to go to school. In the early 1980s, the state of Texas wanted to charge tuition to public school students who were undocumented immigrants. So MALDEF took a case all the way to the Supreme Court, decided in 1982, and the court concluded that under the Constitution, you cannot bar the doors to public school or charge tuition based on a kid's legal status. And that has ensured that many students, millions of students across the country have had the opportunity to get a basic education from kindergarten through 12th grade. We do work fighting against discrimination in hiring and promotions, and we do that in both government employment and private employment. But we also do more and more work trying to ensure that Latino workers receive fair and safe working conditions, meaning that they're paid minimum wage, paid overtime, not subjected to unsafe conditions at work. In immigrants' rights, we fought against state and local laws that target people based on their status or their assumed legal status. This includes laws proposed and enacted 20 years ago in California, like Proposition 187, and even more current laws like Arizona's SB 1070 that's been replicated in 5 other states. It also includes local laws, like one we recently had a victory against that would have required everyone to get a license to rent an apartment. But challenging those local and state laws that target the immigrant community is an essential element of what MALDEF does. In voting rights, we work to ensure that every citizen has the right to vote, has the right to participate in our democracy, and to choose the candidates that they prefer to represent them. At MALDEF, we believe that by championing the rights of Latinos, the nation's largest and fast-growing minority group, we secure the constitutional and civil rights of everyone, helping to craft a better nation, truer to its principles of equity and opportunity for all. Please join in supporting us in this critical mission. Thank you.
On behalf of MALDEF, our Board of Directors, our President and General Counsel, Thomas Saenz, and MALDEF's regional Chicago staff, I welcome all of you to our first Latino State of the State address in Illinois. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are streaming live throughout the country, and some people are even watching us from other parts of the world. We are here to discuss the important issues affecting Latinos in Illinois in the areas of education, immigrant rights, voting rights, and access to public resource equity. The state of Illinois is known for being one of the most Latino and immigrant-friendly states in the country. Our legislature has passed laws that provide access to preschool, to in-state tuition in public universities, and to state-funded health insurance for children and pregnant women without regard to their immigration status. More recently, Illinois joined the ranks of states passing progressive legislation allowing our undocumented population to obtain driver's licenses, and became the first state in the nation to enact a law creating a private scholarship fund for undocumented students. These advancements did not occur by chance. They came about because of the hard work of organizations and individuals like our panelists joining us this afternoon. However, there are many challenges still facing our Latinos in the state of Illinois. Despite the Latino community's growth and contributions to the culture and economy of our state during the past decade, Latinos are still not receiving their fair share of public resources. Based on research conducted by the Latino Policy Forum, had it not been for the growth in the Latino population, Illinois would have lost 2 congressional seats instead of just 1 during the 2010 redistricting cycle. In addition, Illinois Latinos will help bring $30 billion in federal funding to the state over the next 10 years. Nevertheless, Latino demographic growth and economic contributions to the states have not resulted in comparable increases in investment and representation for our community. Indeed, in recent years, the state's fiscal problems have resulted in severe cuts to grants awarded to Latino-led organizations that serve as those with the most need in our community. These fiscal problems have resulted in funding cuts to early childhood education despite the general consensus that such programs can significantly help to equalize the educational attainment disparities that exist in our community. Moreover, Latino representation in state employment and in appointed positions to state boards and commissions has not kept pace with our community's growth. Similarly, Latino representation in school boards throughout the state is dismal, even in communities with sizable Latino populations, thanks in no small measure to at-large election systems. MALDEF, along with its partners who are represented in our panel this afternoon, have been addressing these and other issues to ensure that the needs and interests of our community are met in the future. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight. He is without a doubt one of the most brilliant legal minds in our profession, and he is the right person to be leading MALDEF's proud tradition of defending the civil rights of Latinos in the United States. Please welcome MALDEF's President and General Counsel, Thomas Saenz.
Thank you, Alonso. Welcome, everyone, to this Latino State of the State discussion in Illinois. Welcome to those of you who are here with us tonight in person, and to those who may be watching today or in the future online. We are here at the Instituto Cervantes of Chicago to discuss the concerns, the accomplishments, and the policy issues facing the Latino community in Illinois. It's appropriate that this is the fourth state, therefore one of the initial states where MALDEF has held a Latino State of the State discussion. But why would we be in Illinois? Some of you not from Illinois may want to ask that question. As you've just heard from our current regional counsel, our leader in Chicago, Alonso Rivas, MALDEF is continuing to work through its staff continuously in the courts in Illinois and in neighboring states, in the legislature in Springfield and beyond, to promote our mission of protecting and promoting the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. But this is not a new endeavor for us in Illinois. Indeed, over the years we have had many, many MALDEFian staff members, some of whom are here tonight, and I want to acknowledge them, who have contributed to that decades worth of work promoting civil rights for Latinos. We have had an office in Chicago for over 30 years. And in particular, I want to acknowledge the presence of the founding director of the Chicago office, Virginia Martinez. Over those 30 years, our lawyers and other advocates have engaged in strong work in support of the Latino community and its right to vote, its right to education, its right to fair employment, and its right to be treated fairly regardless of immigration status. Alonso, our current leader, follows in a long line of successful civil rights advocates who have gone on to continue to contribute to Illinois and to the nation, including 3 current judges. But the mere fact that we've been here for over 30 years wouldn't necessarily dictate that this is the place where we would hold a Latino State of the State discussion. But the fact is that Illinois has national significance. Not merely because this is one of the states with the longest presence in significant numbers of Latinos in the country, where Chicago and the entire state have in part been built through the strong efforts of our Latino population. And it's not just because this is a state in the middle of the country. And it's not just because this is a state as a result of the historic 2008 presidential election, an election in which the Latino community, everyone would acknowledge, played a critical role, and the equally historic 2012 presidential election, where almost unanimously pundits and analysts would attribute the result to the Latino voting community. But as a result of those 2 elections, of course, our nation has been led for nearly 5 years by a president who comes from the state of Illinois. But that's not the reason that we're here either. It's also not because, as Alonso has already pointed out, this is a state that is distinguishing itself positively as one of the most immigrant-friendly, interested in integrating the immigrant population into the economy, into society, into strengthening the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. But that's not the reason that we're here as well. It's a combination of all of these together with the following fact. The state of Illinois has a population demographics that very closely mirrors the entire country. So that when we talk about states like California, Texas, New Mexico, looking like the future of the United States, we cannot leave out the critical state of Illinois. Because today, Illinois is the United States in microcosm. Just as 1 in 6 Americans, according to the 2010 census across the country, is Latino, 1 in 6 Illinois residents is Latino today. Just as 13% of our national population is African American. In Illinois, it's a slightly higher 15%. Just as about 5% of our population nationwide is Asian American. 5% of Illinois residents are Asian American. But beyond that, if you look at the schools in Illinois, you have a sense of the future of not just this state, but the entire nation. Nearly 1 in 4 public school students in this state is now Latino. That's not just a measure of our importance in the school system, but a measure of our importance to the future workforce and success of this state. Once again, that statistic is mirrored nationwide, where more than 1 in 5 public school students across the entire United States is now Latino, and 1 in 4 of children of preschool age nationwide is Latino. You cannot escape the fact that if you look at the future of not just this state, but the entire nation, you need not imagine what that future is. You need only walk to a local kindergarten, to a local elementary school, and you will have a sense of what our nation, what its workforce, what its leadership will look like in future years. So as a nation, we have much to learn from the state of Illinois. I was recently at a forum in our nation's capital where I engaged in a good-natured debate with State Representative Trey Martinez-Fisher from Texas about whether Texas or California was a better example for what the future United States should be. Both states are 2 most populous states with populations of 38% Latino. But in fact, a better reflection of the future of this nation may be here in Illinois. And yet, as Alonso has already described, what we see is a story of some contradiction. Yes, this is a state that has distinguished itself through its interest in immigrant integration. It is a state that has a mature and growing Latino political leadership. It is a state that, as I mentioned, has produced, with the great strength of the Latino voting community, the current President of the United States. A president whose political leadership was developed in the city of Chicago and in the state of Illinois. And yet, with that president's leadership, we too see contradictions. We can, for example, and do celebrate the appointment by President Obama of the first Latina Supreme Court justice in the history of this nation, the impactful and inspiring Justice Sonia Sotomayor. But at the same time as we celebrate the shattering of that barrier, we recognize in this, his second term, there is but one cabinet secretary who is Latino. We have not seen that few Latinos at that level of leadership in our government in over a quarter century. And so at the same time as we celebrate the enactment 3 years ago of the Affordable Care Act, because of its impact on the Latino community in particular, but because of its recognition that Latinos and others, all communities, their health is a concern to all of us nationwide. But while we celebrate that achievement, we have to review the current discussion with a critical eye. The focus of the discussion has been on a small percentage of those who have had to give up their existing health insurance plans to adopt plans that better mirror the requirements of the ACA. And despite that discussion, there has been no discussion of the even greater number of individuals nationwide, namely undocumented immigrants, who have been totally excluded from healthcare reform, even barred from participating in the unsubsidized exchanges. And so we celebrate an attention on education and the need to ensure that there is greater investment in securing more positive outcomes in public education nationwide, even while we lament that the national discussion about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act has failed to focus on the growing Latino community and the many within that community who are English learners, and the need to focus on eliminating the education gap. And so we celebrate under this administration the program of deferred action for childhood arrivals, a recognition of not just the efforts, but of the contributions ongoing of those within our community brought here as children and who have endeavored and fought to ensure that they can contribute to our future growth. At the same time, as we celebrate the DACA program, we lament that this is also an administration that is continuing to break records with the number of deportations, removals from our nation. Progress with limitation. So much a feature of this experience nationwide, an experience under a president elected with Latino votes who came out of this state. As Alonso indicated in his remarks, we see some of the same contradictions, progress, and challenges in this state and in this city. And so the discussion today is a critical discussion not just for Illinois, not just for Chicago, but really for the entire nation. To understand in microcosm, particularly with so many critical decisions not being made in Washington, D.C., but being made in state capitals and urban capitals across the country. To see and understand the challenges that we in the Latino community face to ensure that that future, so inevitably dominated by the children, Latino children, in such great numbers in our schools, that that future is one of progress not only for the entire nation, but for the Latino community that is so critical to its success. With that preface and understanding of how important this is as a national discussion, let's now meet our esteemed panelists from Illinois. We have truly been fortunate to get a panel of folks who understand the critical issues faced in this state and understand how they situate in the national atmosphere. Let me begin to the far right. Not in any respect ideologically, of course. But our good friend Ray Lopez Calderon is the executive director of Common Cause Illinois. Prior to working with Common Cause, Ray was an organizer with the Gamaliel Foundation, where he founded the Alianza Leadership Institute, a unique Latino organizing institute. He has a long history in Illinois and holds a Juris Doctorate from DePaul College of Law. In his spare time, He blogs at cockroachpeople.com. Welcome, Ray. Next to Ray, we have Dr. Laila Suleiman Gonzalez, the founding executive director of the Illinois Latino Family Commission. Not only is Dr. Gonzalez the founding executive director, in 2007 she wrote the legislation to establish the commission. Previously, she was director of strategic planning and chief results officer for the Illinois Department of Human Services. She is also a visiting professor at Loyola University Chicago, where she directs the Human Services program. She too has deep roots in this community. She received her degree in applied developmental psychology at Loyola University of Chicago, and she too has a JD from DePaul. And next to Dr. Gonzalez is someone who needs no introduction, certainly in this crowd or indeed nationwide, and that is the inimitable Sylvia Puente, the executive director of the Latino Policy Forum, the only public policy and advocacy organization in the Chicago metropolitan area working to improve educational outcomes for children, make housing accessible and affordable, promoting just immigration reform, and building the influence and leadership of the Latino community. Sylvia is also the convener of the Illinois Latino Agenda, a coalition of organizations working to promote Latino interests in Illinois. Sylvia has a 25-year career, including stints in academia, as well as working with government, and a long, long career in the nonprofit sector. She received her MA from the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago. And finally, right next to me, is Fred Sau, the Public Policy Director at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, where he provides technical support, trainings, and presentations on immigration-related topics to service providers, immigrant community organizations, and all others who work with immigrants. He describes himself as a recovering attorney, a description that might apply to others on the panel here, Fred. He practiced law previously at the Rockford office of Prairie State Legal Services, and he received his law degree from the University of Michigan. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for being here.
Well, I definitely feel like the minority on the panel, being the only non-lawyer.
We know that you can hold your own, Sylvia. That's why I put you right in the middle. You can fight off lawyers on both sides. I want to begin with this issue of contradictions. And I want to start with what I think is a fair description that Alonso used and that I echoed, which is that Illinois is one of a handful of states, both at state and local level, that have really made great strides in working toward immigrant integration. And also, of course, elected leaders from this state, whether in the White House or in the House of Representatives, have certainly been at the forefront of the national campaign for federal immigration reform. So Fred, let's start with that.
Sure.
Where are we going with federal immigration reform? Should we all be as pessimistic as some are? And what needs to be done in this state to move that closer to reality?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And thank you for having me on this panel. Obviously, here in Illinois, we are blessed with very strong leadership on immigration reform. People like Senator Richard Durbin, Congressman Luis Gutierrez, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, as well as many local leaders who've taken up the mantle and in fact asserted national leadership on immigration reform. Illinois is home to roughly 500,000 undocumented immigrants, and as you suggested, it is a microcosm of the entire country in that regard. Roughly 75% of those undocumented immigrants are immigrants from Mexico. Another 10% are from other Latin American countries. So roughly 85% of the undocumented population in this state are Latino. And as you noted, many Latino voters, including many Latino immigrants who are citizens who could vote, swung very heavily toward the Democrats in the 2012 elections. So much so that many people in the punditry and many leaders in Congress realized that we have to resolve the immigration issue. So the Senate, fortunately got busy with drafting legislation and moving it forward. They ended up doing their job and passing a bill in June. The bill was somewhat of a mixed bag. I think all of us will agree. While it did provide a path to citizenship for many of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, it did also include provisions ramping up border enforcement, to the tune of $46 billion over 10 years, and would double the size of the Border Patrol. So, many organizations, including mine, took the position that we need to keep this process moving. We need to pass this bill out of the Senate, get this over to the House of Representatives, and come to a final product that could end up on the president's desk that would provide a path to citizenship. Unfortunately, once the Senate finished this job, the House has delayed in figuring out what it wants to do. They have pretty much out of hand dismissed the comprehensive Senate bill. The House leadership has taken the line that we need to break off chunks of this issue and address them in a piecemeal fashion. And unfortunately, even many of those piecemeal bills that have been considered in committee have not moved forward to the House floor. So, what we have to do is keep reminding the House leadership in particular that we need to resolve this issue. It's for the good of the country, and it's for the good of our immigrant communities in particular. As we speak, there are a number of immigrant leaders who are fasting on the National Mall. They're in their fourth week of this fast to call attention to the need for immigration reform. We need to also continue to put pressure on on our elected leadership to keep this issue alive, so that when the opportunity arises, we can we can finally take action in Congress to enact legislation. Having said that, part of the onus is on President Obama himself. As you note, he has been deporting immigrants at a record pace, 400,000 people a year. That's roughly the population of Cleveland or Miami every single year, if you can imagine that. The president has shown that, with respect to younger immigrants who came as children, that he's willing to take initiative to halt deportations and provide immigration relief. The challenge that's facing him now is whether he would be willing to take a similar step for other undocumented immigrants, whether it be people who've been here for a long stretch of time, or the parents of people who've received deferred action, or even parents of U.S. citizen children. So just as we need to ramp up pressure on Congress, we need to also call out the president for his record of deportations and call on him to take action to halt this trend of deportations.
So let me ask you this. There are some who might assert, we know what Illinois State's position is on immigration reform. It's at the forefront of being immigrant friendly. Mm-hmm. It's demonstrated that. It's a state that's solidly blue, as they say. So does Illinois still have a role to play in changing national policy on immigration? Or is it a state that is going to have less of an impact than other states where the issue is more controversial?
Well, I think, Illinois being certainly one of the larger states, any presidential candidate would want to have Illinois in its column no matter what. The fact that Illinois is historically blue, I think, bodes well for current trends in national politics. But I think we all know that all politics is local. And I think certainly what we need to understand, because I've had this conversation with folks that say, well, why should I vote? We know that Illinois is going to be blue. it really, the local electorate and local elections and local public policy is really where I think, as was said earlier in your opening, makes a difference. The Latino Policy Forum, the organization that I direct along with some of my other colleagues here on the panel, is very invested in looking at state policy. And even though we have a solidly blue legislature on both sides of the aisles, as well as our governor, it has not boded well, and there is no less debate and no less rancor, and certainly hasn't meant that everything that we would want is a slam dunk, because anyone who knows Illinois politics in Springfield knows that even with all those Democrats, the chaos, the controversy still continues. So I think what's really important, especially as we have seen both the Latino and the immigrant community grow in Illinois, is that we still have to leverage the collective Latino voice to influence policy at the state and local level.
So Ray, I think most pundits surmised with good reason that immigration was a driving issue for the Latino community in 2012. Is that still a driver in 2014? Will we see the same sort of participation? Will we see the same, not only participation, but impact of the Latino community, not just in Illinois, but nationwide, with immigration as a driving issue?
I think it will be, and I think it will be partly because there's so much work that's been done in since the last election to sort of highlight the issues that's been happening with, for example, young people. Some of the work that ICRR has done, other organizations throughout the country have really shown the impact that these laws have had on families, on young people, gay and lesbian couples. I mean, there's been a lot more that's come to the surface. I also think that because we had an influence and people noticed it last time, I think Latinos, for lack of a better term or phrase, have tasted blood. And I think that's something that our leaders, at least the strongest leaders we have been building on. So I definitely think it's going to be an issue. I did want to add something to what Silvio's response was earlier, which was also related to your question, which is where does Illinois stand in terms of the national the national immigration discussion? I think one of the things that people forget is that Illinois, it's not just that we have Latino leadership and we have Latino positions or immigrant positions, but we have very strong, influential legislators and leaders that influence all levels of policy, not just things that are uniquely Latino focused. So, for example, Senator Dick Durbin is here in our state. Even within the Republican Party, you know, we have a quasi-moderate like Mark Kirk who is influential. Those are things that we can leverage for all levels, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's immigration. And I think certainly for immigration, there's things to be had. I also think that there's a lot of financial interests in Illinois. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of corporate sort of interests in the state. And so in Illinois, we Latinos can look strongly at how the immigration conversation is being formed, not just by the political machinations in the legislature, but like where is the money coming from? Why is this border reform being so strongly pushed? Where's the corporate agenda to build fences and to build things that are going to keep Latinos out? You know, the new war, as Stephen Colbert called it, on the border. Where is that coming from? And Illinois is in a very strong central position to do that.
I also think, though, Tom, it's really important to, I think what we're starting to see now, and I'm sure others and Fred can add to this, is we're really starting to see fatigue, I think not just in Illinois, but around the nation, as we feel like our hopes get raised, we have a Senate bill passed, we get so close, but yet we're still so far away. And I think there's still just tremendous issue education to be done, both to say this is obviously taken decades, and we hope and we see the end in sight, but it still may not happen for several more years. And we really need to do, you know, one of the things that the Latino Policy Forum does, we run an immigrant issue education program, which we're taking applications for now, to really try to help our community leadership understand the history of immigration reform in this country, that just because the Senate passed a bill doesn't make it law, that the process of democracy in this nation is complicated and takes a long time. Just because the president says he wants it doesn't make it so, right? So how do we really help our community leadership and all the people who are impacted understand that this really is a complicated process that takes a long time. And how do we still keep and sustain the momentum when so many have been at this for so long?
Let me add two things. First off, I mean, we're not beat yet. Even though the House leadership has been slow walking this issue, there's still opportunities that could arise next year. Even though it is an election year, there's still some possible windows of opportunity, particularly after the filing deadlines for many of the state primaries that are going to happen. So, we need to, still be aware of those possible windows of opportunity and take advantage of them. I would also cite that back in 2010, right after the defeat of the DREAM Act in the U.S. Senate, by the way, that legislation got a majority vote. It just couldn't break the 60 needed to undo the filibuster. Immigrant youth leaders here in Illinois didn't sit back and take the defeat. They got motivated. And what ended up happening was they channeled their disappointment into energy on the state level that ended up with the enactment of the Illinois DREAM Act, the legislation that Alonzo mentioned in his introduction. So, I say this as a way of pointing out that there continue to be opportunities, as tired as some of us may feel. There's still opportunities for action both on the federal and the state level. And I suppose later in the conversation we may talk about some of those opportunities.
So, Lila, I mentioned that certainly one of the issues related to immigration of great concern that doesn't get as much discussion, even as we implement the Affordable Care Act, is how the immigrant population was left out of that equation. I wonder if you talk a little bit about how healthcare reform is impacting the Latino community, is impacting the immigrant Latino community here in Illinois as we move toward full implementation of the historic act.
Well, I think you've mentioned the word contradiction, and I think we see that all throughout each one of the issues that we're talking about. So healthcare reform overall has tremendous potential for helping our communities become healthier. Only 1 out of 3 Latinos is insured at this time. So we have 2/3 of Latinos who have the potential of securing some kind of medical coverage, and that's great news. However, we have to ensure that they actually do have access, adequate access, and availability, and that they're shepherded and helped through the process, because with 2/3 being outside of the system for so long, it's really difficult to just jump in and know all of the language of insurance and how to make the right decision for your family. It impacts our community because we have mixed status families in so many of our households. And so it's not an easy task. It's not an easy task for the family to decide what's best for its members, particularly when you have the individual mandate as part of something that's important for individuals in our community to take into account. It's now the law. But how do you comply with the law in a mixed status household while at the same time protecting members who may not have the legal status right now to be able to access the possibilities? We know that, at least in Illinois, again, one of the features of this state in terms of its immigrant friendliness is that we have been able to maintain the All Kids program for all children, and as you mentioned, also for pregnant women, regardless of documentation status. But that's still a fight in the Springfield every year to make sure that coverage continues. I think the Latino Family Commission is really committed to continuing to look for a solution for all undocumented individuals in our community who are not covered by All Kids, and figuring out a solution which may involve the private or corporate sector, but looking for some innovations there. In addition, it's not, we focus a lot on enrollment and on the individuals, but if 2/3 of Latinos are outside of the insurance and plan and healthcare system, the traditional healthcare system, then once those Latinos come in, how is that system going to respond linguistically and culturally to the needs of the community. The system is not ready. We have workforce development issues like we do in education. Do we have enough trained bilingual doctors and nurses and medical staff and, really all across the healthcare system? Moreover, some of the shifts that are happening in the state of Illinois in terms of public insurance or Medicaid and moving some of the funding into managed care entities have actually an impact on the Latino community because Latino providers will no longer be able to contract directly with the state and provide the service that they've always provided to the community. And they're the trusted entities for families to go to. So we've got to figure out how to keep them sustainable so they can survive and participate in the new marketplace that from a provider level opens up through Obamacare.
It seems to me that one of the animating principles behind healthcare reform was a notion,
Yes.
I think an unexceptionable notion, that really health is at bottom a community issue. Individuals have health concerns, but we know they have impacts on the entire community. So if we deny health care to certain individuals, that doesn't mean that they won't end up with an illness that could be
Correct.
passed on to others.
Correct.
And even more importantly, an issue that was driven home for me earlier this week at another forum that I attended, if we fail to provide mental health services, we've seen regularly in the headlines the impacts on others when we fail to address mental health concerns. So this whole notion that we could leave out an entire sector of a population, a huge sector of our population, and as you've indicated, Lylan, integrate it into our families because of the mixed status phenomenon that we know is so prevalent. And yet, that significant departure from the animating principle doesn't get discussed. It's not a part of the debate. Not since the outburst on the House floor during the debate around enactment has the issue gotten attention. Instead, as I may have inarticulately said in my opening, we're focused on folks who are being forced to give up plans that they may like because those plans don't meet the minimum criteria. That seems to me is consistent with the principle we want everybody to have minimum health care because we recognize failing to provide minimum levels of services has impacts on all of us. How do we shift that debate at this point in implementation? Is it just something that we need to deal with state by state, or is there a way for us to get the national discussion refocused on that violation of the animating principle?
And I think it hits on two fronts. One is the public health issue, which you've highlighted. So really, if we leave a whole sector of the population without access to affordable, adequate, high-quality health care, then we really are all at risk. Part of the problem I was alluding to earlier is that those community-based agencies, those federally qualified health centers in our communities also stand to disappear because of this notion or assumption that we're all covered now. We don't know what the funding is going to look like in the future for those particular entities in our community that are helping the most vulnerable in our community that don't have access anywhere else. But I think the other front in which we've tried to move the discourse for healthcare is that it is a human right. It's a very basic human right that you can provide at least the basic health care for our community and for the members of our community. So I think we are studying very closely what other states are doing. We know that California is moving very aggressively from a public health perspective to say we really need to try to cover as many people as possible. So we're studying what other states are doing. I think, like in so many other areas, the states have to take a leadership role to really influence what the federal, what the federal government does. But I think we have to get through even the first step of trying to fully implement Obamacare, I think, even before we can begin addressing at the federal level the issue of really, if we're talking about coverage for all, it has to be coverage for all, not leaving huge sectors out. In Illinois, we're talking about 870,000 people who will be left uninsured.
I think that this issue has also been sort of ignored as a part of what's going on with the immigration reform debate, even though it is a critical element of really being able to succeed in integrating in the state or in the nation to ensure that people have access to health care. And indeed, as health care reform goes forward, as you mentioned, Lila, we don't really know what the ultimate repercussions are of implementation, what that may mean for primary care clinics
Correct.
that at least have been available to date for the immigrant population. So Fred, I wonder if you talk a little bit about how healthcare access has or has not played a role in the discussion around immigration reform.
Yeah. In fact, even the Senate bill, with its path to citizenship, expressly excludes legalizing immigrants who are on this path to citizenship from participation in the healthcare exchanges and from participating in the subsidy programs. So that plus issues with respect to access even to basic safety net benefits has been a fairly controversial point within the whole immigration reform debate. We understand that there were fiscal considerations that played into the development of that language. The senators wanted to push off any significant expenses 10 years out to minimize the cost, minimize the fiscal impact. But unfortunately, what even the members of the Gang of Eight, who drafted this legislation, either failed to consider or were unwilling to incorporate was in consideration of the real life needs of immigrant families who are trying to get on this path to citizenship, and unfortunately that being the Senate bill. It's kind of hard to contemplate whether legislation that would move out of the House, a much more conservative chamber, would address this issue in a satisfactory way.
And yet those fiscal considerations didn't seem to play much of a role when Corker-Hoven was added to the Senate bill at the end to spend billions at the border, double the size of the Border Patrol.
Yeah.
But it is a challenge to focus on secondary and tertiary impacts of failing to provide healthcare services, because you can't put a dollar sign on those, but we know that the impact, both financially and humanistically, would be dramatic.
It is, and keep in mind also on the path to citizenship, there are income requirements that legalizing immigrants need to maintain and need to surpass in order to take the next step to get a green card. And there are also employment requirements as well. So it's certainly we could regard it as a rigorous path, but it is a path that is fraught with peril, and particularly if there's not a safety net that could catch people if they run into trouble in maintaining their employment or maintaining their income. What is going to happen to those immigrants who fall off the path.
And even now, I think for those people who have the hope of comprehensive immigration reform, they're actually leery of accessing any kind of public benefit or even the subsidy because they feel that it might affect them in the future when they do have an opportunity to get on that path. So for themselves and for their children.
So returning to that animating principle, but shifting gears a bit, of the notion that all health is a community public concern. One area where that seemed to be a very well-established notion is public education, where we began in this nation to create public schools out of a recognition that providing an education to everyone ultimately benefited everyone. It didn't just benefit the child or student who received the education or the parents of that child, but the entire community would benefit. And perhaps as a result of that, of course, we've now got access to public education in part thanks to a MALDEF case 31 years ago, Plyler versus Doe, for all students. But Sylvia, talk, if you will, a little bit about some of the education challenges that we still face, even in a state like Illinois, where, as I mentioned, almost a quarter of public school students are Latino. No one could deny how significant they are to the success of public education. But what are we seeing here?
You know, it's really, I think, such an interesting contrast, because while we know that in some ways Illinois is so progressive, Illinois has the largest funding gap in the nation among all school districts, in that the amount of resources that we invest in education. So no other state has a greater gap between school districts that afford to $20,000 per student versus school districts that can only afford $5,000 per student. It's the widest gap in the nation. And what our legislature has done in its infinite wisdom with the fiscal crisis, they've reduced funding to 89% of what's in statute. But the way that actually plays out is that obviously lower wealth, high poverty districts get more. So the solution that they've implemented in a time of economic crisis is to further exacerbate inequality, and it is the low property wealth, low property tax, high poverty districts that are disproportionately impacted by the funding scheme that they've put in place. So they have further exacerbated inequality. I chair something called the Education Funding Advisory Board. To have adequacy in education, we would have to double the amount of money that we're putting into education in the state of Illinois. So it really, I think, is a questionable future in that sense. At the same time, 25% of our students we know in the state are Latino. We're now at the tipping point where just under half of students in the entire state of Illinois are children of color. So it really is a question of what is the future of the state, given the lack of investment and the diminishing investment in education that we're putting in to our education system in Illinois. On the other hand, Illinois is again a trailblazer, and that we're the first state in the nation to now require a bilingual early childhood education, so that if a child whose first language is not English goes to preschool, there should be a teacher there who can speak to them in a language that they can understand, which up until the recent past hasn't occurred. And it really was a checkerboard of language development, in that children who would go into preschool speaking Spanish would be educated in English, and then they would go into kindergarten and they would go into bilingual education and be taught in Spanish and or English. So it's a checkerboard of language development, which is not, most of the research says, is not optimal for language development. The children really need to be grounded in one language or the other. But I think to one of the points that you were making in the opening comments too, Tom, while we know that the face of Illinois really closely mirrors what's happening across the nation in terms of our racial and ethnic distribution, it's not just that 25% of our school children are Latino. What does that mean for the future of Illinois? What we know today is that 2/3 of the growth in the labor market in the state of Illinois is because of Latinos entering the labor force. So we are already at the point where if employers want to have a qualified, skilled labor force, we have to ensure that our Latino students, our young adults, even our returning to school adults are educated so that they have the skills necessary to compete in the 21st century economy, and that there are employers, and that we continue to have a growing economic base in the state of Illinois.
So Sylvia introduced it, but Lila, I wonder if you might talk more about how these education challenges translate into the economic future of Illinois, or even the economic present.
Yeah, and even the economic present, exactly. And I think that's the way we have tried to approach and continue to approach the link between education and economic development, not just for the Latino community, but really for the whole state. So one of the things that we're seeing, for example, in education is a shift to higher standards. So Illinois is now aligning with the Common Core, both in the K through 12 but also in the GED or alternative high school testing. And that's good. We need to have higher expectations. We need to have higher standards. But until we address the inequity in the funding, then Latino kids continue to go to under-resourced and overcrowded schools. So there's something that doesn't jive with that picture, where we're setting higher standards, it's higher stakes, but then at the same time, we're leaving Latino kids in schools that may not have all of the resources, not even from the basic funding formula. We set them up to fail in terms of the funding and the resources that we're able to provide. And so therefore, when a global marketplace, an Illinois marketplace, a nation marketplace that's moving in terms of what they're looking for in a labor market, high-skilled, high-tech, we've heard a lot about STEM, we hear about energy, now this whole new sector of health, where workforce development needs to match what the opportunities are going to be in the future. We don't have the right pipeline to get our kids from where they are today in preschool all the way to be able to fill the high tech and STEM and energy jobs that are going to be available. And not only that, but we also remove their language. So generally we continue to have a subtractive educational system at a moment where we should be building their language skills. So not only can they be academically successful, which all the research says, dual language makes you higher performing in terms of your metacognitive skills and higher academic achievement. So not only are we not getting the language piece right, but we're also not getting the right resources in place so they can be successful. Illinois has a goal of 60% of its residents to have some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate by 2025. Cannot get there from here when Latinos are 25% of the educational system, when we're getting into college and other higher education at much higher levels than we have in the past, and there's a lot of hoopla about that, but we're not graduating. And so we're getting them in, but we're not really getting to that achievement level.
But there's also a bit of a good news story here too.
Yeah.
So definitely Lila and I have even highlighted the challenges, and those challenges we know are also exacerbated by we have the lowest access to early child education. We still have a significant number of our children who are not finishing high school. But the good news of that story, and this is I think one of the trends that we're seeing certainly in Illinois and I would imagine somewhat nationwide, is we do have both good news and bad news trends going on at the same time. And the good news trend here is because of demographic growth, because there still has been some academic advancement, we've seen a 30% increase in the number of college graduates who are Latino over the past decade. So it's a 30% increase, but because of our demographic growth, that translates into double the number of people who literally have college degrees. So we've seen a doubling of our college graduates, right? So we definitely are seeing both this good news and this bad news trends going on, and I think we see that in other areas of the Latino community as well. So there is, I mean, I can be a pessimist along with the best of them, but there is some hope and optimism here too, because one of those other significant trends, I think, is that while we know we see people in low-wage jobs, we see too many families that are struggling and struggling economically, we've also seen a doubling in the number of households that earn over $75,000 a year. So a growing Latino middle class, and we've seen a greater than 40% increase in our purchasing power. No, I'm sorry, a greater than 80% increase in our purchasing power over the past decade to now over $46 billion in the state of Illinois.
Well, 'tis the season for optimism, even for those of us who might ordinarily be glass half empty kind of folks like myself. Ray, let me ask you this. When it comes to these issues of education equity, historically, I've said that the court system has been the major accountability mechanism, which is a notoriously inefficient, I say, as a career-long civil rights lawyer, a notoriously inefficient way of addressing a major policy concern. But in theory, the real major accountability mechanism for education equity ought to be elections of school board members ought to be the ability for the community, the parents of the students who are most affected, to put in place policymakers who will address their concerns. As Latinos in Illinois, grow in size, not just in Chicago, but in the suburbs and in smaller school districts, what are the challenges in trying to make that a more viable, successful mechanism of addressing education equity concerns? Actually electing school board members, leaders who will address those concerns.
Well, in some places there's challenges like Chicago where you really don't even elect the school board. So let's start with one with structural problems. But I do think that there's sort of been a myth that Latinos don't want to participate in education. And I, as someone who was an organizer for 20 years, working in schools at a lot of education organizations, there's always Latino parents that want to participate. What we don't have is sort of an educated participation. You have our parents that want to get involved, but there's no one out there to really sort of push them towards where they need to be involved. How do you hold people accountable? We've had some varying mechanisms of reform over the years. Going back to the 80s, we had reform with local school councils and sort of more participatory education, very loosely built on a Latino model out of Brazil, but very loosely, I say. But we haven't had, I think, enough of training and education mechanisms for voters and parents and all stakeholders in education. And what we see is, for example, a lot of the major decisions being made are by non-Latino boards of directors, election boards, school boards. I mean, every board you can think of, there's very few Latinos. We have lots of Latino consumers of education, very few people who are driving the agenda. There's a couple problems with that. One is the face of education in general, not just in Illinois, but nationwide, is changing. There's been a strong move towards privatization of education. Most Latinos and even Latino policy leaders are very much not involved at the level of where that's happening, and that's in the lobbying center. With the exception of Latino Policy Forum, you see very few full-time registered Latino lobbyists in Springfield talking about this issue.
We're not full-time registered.
And well, Martin's split half-time, but we very few it's the only other Latino faces I usually see in Springfield. We don't have people understanding how education's changed. We had an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a national organization who's famous for being behind SB 1070 and the Stand Your Ground laws as well. They steamrolled the Illinois Charter School Commission here in Illinois. It was just sort of happened overnight. People didn't see it coming. People don't understand what happened. And even some of our strongest Latino advocates aren't familiar with how ALEC made that happen in Illinois. So for us to get more involved, all of our leaders, our advocates have to begin to train and show people, and I would say, how power is actually working against them in this state. We get excited and we're grateful when someone says, oh, we're going to build a charter school in your community. We're like, we want that. Well, we have no idea what that is. We don't know how it performs compared to a public school. We don't know what impact it would have on workers in our community, but we want it because we're desperate. And I think we don't have enough people at those tables where the decisions are happening. And so it's about training, it's about organizing, and it's about getting those folks that we train and organize and register to vote actually to get out to vote. And a lot of that has to do with really interacting with different types of organizations, not being stuck in one little sector of our communities.
So let me ask you to expand a little bit beyond education and put it in a little bit of a national context. I mentioned in my remarks we have one cabinet secretary who's from the Latino community. It's been a long time since we've seen that dearth of representation at that level. And when you discuss these issues in Washington, D.C., those who defend that outcome assert that we don't have a bench. We don't have those who are ready to step into those positions. We could dispute that, but talk a little bit, Ray, about what we need to do to get more Latino leaders, elected leaders at local and state level to begin to create the bench, if you will, for the future cabinets.
So first of all, while there are fewer candidates available, they are there. That's a load of baloney. That's something that comes up in every state and every council.
The binder's full of
let's start by saying, so let's start with with the non-existence of that. But even if we entertain the idea that we don't have enough, or at least that we need more. I'll say that we do need more, that's for sure. We need to groom those folks. We have folks that are coming out of universities who are being, the cream of the crop of the Latino communities are being scooped up, but they're being scooped up by major corporations and other types of groups that will promise them great amounts of money. And a lot of our people are coming from lower income households, and so it's very attractive to say, you can make $200,000 in a law firm doing this, versus you can make $80,000 being a political leader or a policy leader. It's not very attractive to someone who's coming out of poverty. So we have to, first of all, find the folks who are interested in those things, make them interested. It's a very difficult, almost magical process where that happens, but we can do it by exposing people to public policy and to politics. I was fortunate to be at a breakfast recently that Sylvia's organization hosted with Mayor Julian Castro. Mayor Castro talked about his story. His story was about being dragged to political meetings with his family, with his parents, to see basically how politics works, how does society work, how does community work. And those are the kinds of things that we have to do more. There's very few launching pads in Illinois, but I'm sure, I know it's nationwide as well, but in Illinois in particular, we have very few launching pads of organizations that are grooming Latino leadership to go into these kinds of positions. We come out of DePaul law, which creates a lot of judges. Judges are a big deal here. There's not very many organizations really looking for more and grooming more Latino judges. We have a history of Irish judges in Illinois. Where are the Latinos out there grooming our folks? It's not happening. That's the first thing that the Irish did. We have to think about those things. We also, I think we have to look at sort of grooming Latino leaders that really have stronger character. And I say this only because today in the news we saw that one of our Latino leaders from one of our oldest Latino communities is running for Cook County commissioner now, someone who just got literally out of jail for scandals, corruption scandals. Many of our Latino leaders end up being in that circle. So we need to sort of say, get out of the Chicago model, the Illinois model, and I will throw LA under the bus too, because they're number 2 on the corruption scale according to the University of Illinois Chicago. We need to sort of say, whatever happened to strong leaders, whatever happened to the Cesar Chavez's, whatever happened to those kinds of guys that actually believed in doing the right thing. And then we need to get those kids and put them into public office. We need to get them up there and say it's not okay to screw over your own community or others, but get up there and do the right thing. Because a lot of times, those are the people who fall off on the vote. When someone wants to talk about healthcare for immigrants, it's like, well, I got this deal that I hooked up, so I can't really talk about that. Those are the folks that are not going to push us. We need somebody who's really motivated by the right reasons.
So, Celia, let me go to you. But so talk a little bit about this and talk about it. Again, we've been 5 years under a president who came from Illinois. It's been a long, long time since we had a president from Illinois. How about a Latino future president from Illinois, or a Latino future justice? We've got one in the Supreme Court. I'm just going to say the second most important court in the country, the D.C. Court of Appeals, has never in its history had a Latino judge. Never in its history has there been a Latino judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, which is acknowledged to be the second most important court in the country. What can we do? What should we be doing to have the next leaders from Illinois come from the Latino community?
Yeah, well, obviously I agree with everything that Ray said, and I think one of the other challenges to that is that the Latino community, as it's grown in Illinois, has become so dispersed, with 60% now living outside of Chicago in municipalities literally around the state. So without that intentional place that trains, supports, encourages, I think it really is truly the brave and the strong that agree to run for local office in a community where they may be the only one running. So I think that certainly is a challenge. But MALDEF, Latino Family Commission, and Latino Policy Forum are all conveners of what's called the Illinois Latino Agenda. So we are sort of, with the Illinois Latino Agenda, we are taking the broader long view of how do we create that political power, leverage, and institutional representation at all levels of government, and accountability from those who are in office. I know that Lila can certainly add to that, but the forum also has a leadership program where we're training nonprofit leaders. It's still not grooming them for political office, but it is grooming them for, certainly I think one of the most important jobs in our community is how do we have strong local institutions that represent the Latino community, who provide service to the Latino community. So I think that there are initiatives out there, but we don't and haven't, I think, come together around that political training. But what we are doing through the Illinois Latino agenda is identifying where are those places where we need more boards, more commissioners, more leaders at high levels in government roles and positions. Marla, do you want to?
Just to share that when you look at state boards and commissions, we Latinos make only about 4% of state boards and commissions. And when you look at state employment, we're only at about 4 to 6%. But when you start looking at executive level, we're much lower than that. So the cabinet problem is not only at the White House, it's really across many of the states. And despite what we've been saying about Illinois being so progressive and so immigrant friendly, I think when it comes to Latino issues and the Latino agenda, we are still in the margins. We've got to be front and center. Part of what we're trying to do through the Latino agenda is to come together, because that's really been, honestly, has been one of our issues, is that, once people start getting at different levels of power, then sort of the unified agenda that got that first wave of politicians in is broken. And, there's going to be diversity of opinion in every community, but I think what's made other communities make some of the advances and gain some of that political power has been unity and a comprehensive agenda. That's what we're trying to create through this new, it's a fairly new entity, which is the Latino agenda.
So we're running out of time, so I want to ask all of you now in your closing remarks to be prognosticators. Lila, you've just indicated where, again, the state of Illinois is mirroring the nation, because the statistics you read probably would mirror what we see at the federal level, both in terms of employment and leadership. But now I want you to be prognosticators from Illinois to the nation. And look 11 months from now, November 2014. Not a presidential election, but a critically important midterm general election. And tell us what you see for the Latino community in Illinois and the Latino community nationwide, not just in terms of that election, but between now and that election. And add to that what you think the community needs to do to achieve what you predict. How's that? So let's go down the line. Let's start with Fred.
Okay. Well, let me answer that question by rejoining Ray. Much of the emerging leadership in the Latino community and other immigrant communities is involved in the immigration reform fight. Many of our board members, many of the leaders of our member organizations are deeply, deeply involved in that fight. And in particular, they understand the need to influence lawmakers, and many of them understand that the way to influence elected officials is at the ballot box. And so many of our member organizations host New American Democracy Fellows during election cycles, where young people from the community recruit volunteers and essentially set up get out the vote operations in their local communities. And those operations have on several occasions spawned leaders who've run for elected office, or now that they have experience in running electoral campaigns, are willing to step up and take further leadership. Part of what we've also been doing is training people in a candidate school on the ins and outs of running electoral campaigns, working with media, working with political allies. So this is happening. It may not, the only shame of it is it's not happening year round. But it is happening. There's the germ of real potential political power. The only thing I would add is that we need for Latino and immigrant communities to have a real say. One of the really key things is naturalization and voter registration. Actually, two of the main things. We have in this country 8.5 million lawful permanent residents who are eligible to naturalize, but they haven't. That includes 350,000 here in the state of Illinois. Imagine what political power our communities could wield if all of those people who are eligible for citizenship were to get their citizenship, register to vote, and turn out at the polls.
Sylvia, what do you see in 11 months?
And while we're still a ways away from sending our Latino president to the nation's capital, certainly what I see through the work of many of our partner organizations that the Latino Policy Forum work with, we will have 1,000 more trained parents and skilled parenting education who understand the importance of literacy for their children through our Abriendo Puertas program, which we make available at schools and community centers around. We will have dozens, if not hundreds, of community leaders who have been trained through our Promotores de Migración program, through our Promotores de Vivienda Justa, where we work on housing issues and rights, and through our parent advocacy training, where we take parents to Springfield to testify and talk to their legislators. We will have trained hundreds more parents in those areas. And working with many of our partner organizations, Latino Policy Forum is really, I think, on the forefront of ensuring that we bring those community voices to those policy discussion and decision-making tables. Last year, we worked with partner organizations who testified on the state budget, who testified in early education, who testified in terms of what the needs of the community are. And we had more than 30, submitted more than 30 sets of testimony. So certainly what I see is that we will continue to nurture that nascent but growing leadership to be a more powerful voice in our city council and in our state legislature.
I think building on that, what I see happening, and I see it very much happening in Illinois, is really trying to energize and create an infrastructure of political power that activates the community, as we've been talking about it, but then also activates the corporate sector, the philanthropic sector, and the nonprofit sector, and even the faith community sector in ways that we really haven't come together and be able to push forward in the past. And I think now is the time. I think we have tasted blood, using Ray's word, and I think people are eager to see how else they can influence.
Right.
I think 2014 is going to be a really fun year. There's a lot of things coming up on the pike. There's an attempt to really take a stab at the structural problems with redistricting in the state, which affects us. There's a lot of work that's been done over the last year. Some of us on this panel have been involved with pushing for modernization and more voting access, online voter registration. We're looking at election day registration next year. There's a lot of stuff that's coming up that's going to be pushed next year that's going to really help enhance the discussion around Latino politics and sort of how do we influence structural problems that we really haven't been paying attention to. I also think that there's a lot more collaboration coming up because of those issues, but as well as other issues. One of the reasons I jumped ship from being the leader of a Latino organization to working for Common Cause is that there's so much to be done on the level of sort of root causes of issues affecting our community, particularly with lobbying and moneyed interests. And I think that there's been a sort of an energy afoot in the whole country, but certainly in the state, around what are people doing that is affecting our community. So for example, why aren't corporations in Illinois paying taxes? There's so many that are paying literally zero taxes, yet we have Sylvia and Lila talking about the fact that we are running out of money. We have money being cut in our schools. Why is that happening? And I think people are starting to wise up to that, and this year's really been is a target for a lot of us. So I think it's going to be a good year for Latinos and for all of Illinois.
Great. Well, what I predict is that we will again see a non-surprise surprise, which is the pundits and some of the political leaders will express surprise that the Latino community is in fact coming out and voting intelligently and voting on more than one issue, and that they are concerned not just about a label like immigration reform, but they're concerned about the details and will vote on the details of policy that impacts not just their community, but the state and the entire nation. So with that prediction of a non-surprise surprise, we all have to work together to deliver that surprise to our nation's leaders. And if we do so, I think that the contradictions that we've discussed today, we will no longer see in this state or nationwide, but we will see our community taking its rightful role in leading us toward a prosperous future. With this, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. It's been an invigorating and challenging discussion. We appreciate all of your contributions. And I want to thank all of you who are in the room and those who have watched online for being with us for this Latino State of the State in Illinois.